Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Today we're going to discuss a subject dear to Rob and I's hearts: the use and overuse of imprisonment for children in England and Wales. We're joined by academic Dr. Anne-Marie Day and lawyer Dr. Laura James. Both have worked with and done research about children in custody. Rob, when it comes to imprisoning children, how do we compare to similar countries?
Well, the age at which we can prosecute children in the criminal courts in England and Wales, 10, is much lower than it is commonly across Europe, much more usually 14 or even higher. And children here tend to serve their custodial sentences in a prison establishment. Young offender institutions, they're run by the prison service and they are very prison-like. Other countries tend to keep, wherever possible, children under 18 out of prison-run establishments.
And when you said that children could be prosecuted from the age of 10, that means that they can be locked up from the age of 10 on a sentence of imprisonment in this country.
They can. It's highly unusual. They wouldn't go to prison generally.
We're sorry, they are sentenced to imprisonment.
They can be sentenced to a custodial sentence. It's not called imprisonment, but it is a sentence which involves deprivation of liberty.
Laura, you looked somewhat doubtful at some of the things that Rob said.
Well, first of all, it's called detention, but they are locked up and it feels like prison, so it's semantics, right? And the other thing I was just sort of raising an eyebrow at was sort of saying prison run like a prison. I go in and out of prisons, both children's prisons and adults' prisons all the time, and I would say children's prisons are very much prisons. Quite often you see prisons being converted from children's prisons to adult prisons because they are made to lock people up. So for the YOIs, the Young Offenders Institutes, they look like prisons, they smell like prisons, and they feel like prisons to the kids.
Yeah. Anne-Marie, for what kind of crimes do we sentence children to imprisonment? We read about murder and so on. What's the range?
We've signed up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which says that custody should be used as a last resort and only for the most serious and violent offences. But the reality is very different. We've got about 440 children in custody. Most children are on the shorter term custodial sentences, which is called a detention training order. The vast majority of those are for violence against the person. But if you look at the length of time they're spending in custody, it's about, on average, 3 months, which would suggest that it's quite low level. So it really does beg the question, what is the point in sending kids to custody for a matter of 3 months, often hundreds of miles from home, for quite minor offending? We also still see children going to prison for offences that don't involve violence, that are totally in breach of the United Nations Convention.
What things like criminal damage and theft and stuff like that?
Burglaries, breaching community orders, drug offences. These are all things that could be managed in the community. So it shows that custody isn't being used as it should be. And to give you a couple of examples, a lot of my research has been with children in care. Often they run away from the residential care establishment that they don't want to be placed in. The care worker will call the police. The police will find the child. They'll say, come on, we're taking you back to the placement. The child will say, no, I'm not going there. They'll put hands on the child. The child will bat them away and they're being done for assault police officer and normally a public order offence. And there's many, many cases like that result in children being criminalised.
Laura, you've worked for a long time with children in custody, in prison. Paint a picture for us of the kind of young person we're talking about here.
I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that every child is different. And one of the problems with the system is the failure to treat children individually. So I can tell you plenty of stories, but no one child is the same. And also I should probably say that I specialise in representing child lifers. So we haven't mentioned that, but we are the only country in Western Europe to still have mandatory life sentences for children, and there are many, many of them.
So this is children who commit a homicide offence,
Murder, yeah.
But can they get life sentences for other crimes or no?
Yes, absolutely. They must get a life sentence if they commit a murder, but there are also life sentences available for other serious offences. And of course, that means that a child will be sentenced and to the day they die will be either in prison or liable to be recalled back to prison. Where children are on those life sentences, quite often they will have quite different stories to the run-of-the-mill children, right? So quite often it's the most serious offences that will sometimes be a one-off, sort of out of character, very tragic, obviously terribly serious for everyone involved. The kinds of violent offences is going to quite often be one of those sort of really tragic stories where you have young people who have been involved in community violence, where they've often been attacked, injured quite seriously themselves. They're living in a state of fear and hypervigilance. They've often got experiences of being in care. They haven't got someone to go home to necessarily for advice, and they will end up in awful fights and situations on the street, which can end up with serious injuries.
I mean, Anne-Marie, the number of children locked up in England and Wales has reduced really dramatically in the last 15 years or so. Does that mean that there are now a hard core, if you like, of these violent young people, some of them highly dangerous, or is that an oversimplification?
I would say that's an oversimplification. You may hear people use that to try and justify the use of harsh measures against children in custody. But no, I mean, the number of children is reduced in custody, but if you look at the demographic of the children and the range of offences, it is still quite similar. I think potentially the violent offences may have increased slightly, but it's stayed broadly the same, which would suggest that the reason the number of children has reduced in custody is because the overall number of children has reduced that enter the criminal justice system.
As someone who's been going in and out of custody for the best part of 20 years, locked in rooms with young people, talking to them about their attitude to violence, what's important to them in their life, I really don't think that we have seen this sort of narrative of hardening come true in any way. It's the same as it's always been. And that doesn't diminish. They may have caused some terrible harm, and it's really important that we acknowledge that that is not acceptable. But when I ask a child in custody, you know, who's the most important person in your life, which is something I always ask, and they start to tell me almost always about their mum, and they go very quiet, sometimes welling up, you can see that these are just children. And I've worked with adults, you know, who've got hundreds and hundreds of offences in their background who may have become hardened criminals, but actually I can't really think of any child who already has. Most of them really want to go on and live a meaningful, positive life.
Anne-Marie, so you resist the narrative that they are kind of more feral, more violent, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, that term feral just makes my stomach turn. I mean, the dehumanising treatment that we already subject our children to is shocking, but I would completely agree with what Laura's just said. As a former practitioner and a youth justice researcher, I've visited dozens of children in custody, and what I would say is that every time I speak to them, what I see is a vulnerable child, a child that is scared, that is struggling to survive in a very harsh environment, is struggling to make sense of it, wants to be treated as a human being, and is very often appreciative of someone coming to visit them and interact with them in that very simple way. And again, not to diminish the harm that they've caused, but if we want to actually work meaningfully with these kids in custody, then we need to be meeting them where they're at and giving them a child-centred response, which certainly custody is anything but.
On what Anne-Marie just said there, I think it's really important because sometimes children have been hardened by the environments that they have grown up in, but also by the environment of custody. It is noisy. It is frightening, particularly in the YOIs I'm talking about, in the prison establishments. And sometimes children won't necessarily say, I'm scared and I'm frightened. I often stay in touch with the young people for years afterwards. And one young man was in a secure children's centre, an STC, and he just said, I want to go to man jail, get me out of here. And I said, are you sure? That's not a good place for you to move. You've got a lot more support here.
So he wanted to go from a non-prison establishment into basically a prison.
Yeah, he was in a secure training centre and he wanted to go to man jail. He called it a children's prison. And we talked it all through and he was absolutely insistent. Didn't feel right at the time, but lawyers have to do what their clients tell them. And 10 years later, he disclosed to me that he had wanted that because he was utterly traumatised, because he had been in very close proximity to where a child had been restrained to the point where they then subsequently died. And he was having flashbacks and nightmares and he was traumatised by that whole experience.
Restrained by staff.
Yeah. And it was, 10 years later, he came to me and said, can you help me get some therapy? I can't get this out of my head. And I couldn't even tell you at the time. And I thought I was a very good child-centred lawyer that, people could trust. But as a young teenager, he just had to get himself out of there. And he actually put himself in a harsher, less supportive environment because of that trauma. And that's a pattern I've seen throughout my career now, working with young people over many, many years. Quite often they'll come back to me years later and tell me of all the trauma that they were experiencing at the time. They just couldn't say out loud.
Mm. I mean, a lot of people do believe that the people in youth custody are more serious, and there's lots of gang membership. If you read the reports of inspectors, they say the problem is that all of these young people have to be kept apart the whole time because they will commit serious violence on each other. I mean, Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, not making that up, is he, Laura?
The phenomenon of keep aparts, as they call it in prison language, which is keeping particular individuals apart from each other, is absolutely true. And I've sat in meetings where we've really been trying to scratch our heads and think, how can we try and find a safe space for this young person where they will not be attacked by another young person? And quite often the answer is there isn't anywhere else in the prison that they can go to, and therefore they are going to continue to spend 23 hours a day locked up in their cell, which is horrific. The word gang, I've got to take issue with it. We know there are so many connotations with that word. Most kids actually are not in a gang in the way you would see it in the movies or you would hear about in the media. There are individual children that have got problems with each other. It's more about where they come from and how they identify, and it's really unhelpful to talk about gangs. So yes, there are lots of children who believe they will not be safe if they mix with certain other children. That's an institutional failure of the establishment. Equally, you do not get that in the secure children's homes, which is an alternative type of place where you can have children detained, where children can be locked up, which are much smaller and much more focused on child welfare.
Anne-Marie, just still focusing on these child prisons, these young offender institutions, the inspection report actually on dreadful conditions, which kind of don't seem to be getting any better. What are these conditions like in child custody now?
I mean, they're horrific. And it was 10 years ago that the prison inspectors basically stated that none of the young offenders institutions were safe to hold children. Now, since then, they've continued to hold children and further deteriorate. I mean, research shows that the only way that children can survive young offenders institutions is to either fight or keep their head down. And by fighting, often that involves aligning yourself with an individual or a group, or keeping your head down and isolating yourself in your cell, which can then make you vulnerable to being bullied. There's very little education. They're supposed to get 15 to 30 hours a week, but often due to a lack of resource, they're getting given worksheets or things that are just not appropriate to them. I mean, the vast majority of children are actually on lockdown, so they're locked up in their cells in solitary confinement for on average between 20 to 23 hours a day. And often when I tell members of the public that, they're shocked. They don't realise that our children are being held in effectively adult prisons in solitary confinement. And this is torture. According to the United Nations, this is torture. And we have got sanctioned torture of our children. And people need to know about this, because how on earth is this going to help them? How is it going to help them move forward? Kids come out more damaged, and this is why we see very, very high reoffending rates. It's just a horrific environment that has been called institutionalised abuse.
I mean, that's an awful picture. I mean, Laurie, is there any way in which these institutions help to turn children, young people away from crime? Or is it a wholly negative picture?
I have definitely come across a number of children who have managed to change. Whether that is because of the institutions or despite them is an open question. There are some good people in the system who genuinely want to help children and who try their best. But when it comes to the YOIs, they just don't have the resourcing and the staff and the infrastructure. I mean, imagine living your life in the size of a car parking space or less. It's not just being unable to do education, it's your whole world being confined to this tiny space. Often, the windows barely open and the sounds that you will hear day in, day out. There are some new bits of prisons. There's the Keppel unit up in Wetherby. That is nicer, but it's still got that vibe.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say as well is that there's more and more research showing that the population of children in the justice system generally are neurodivergent. So being locked up in an environment that is very overly stimulating to the senses for potentially 22 hours a day, if you've got ADHD or you're autistic, can be extremely triggering. And often it can lead to natural responses that lead to children flooding their cells, repeatedly pressing the buzzer because they need to get out, smashing it up because they just can't handle it. And then what does the prison regime do? It punishes them. And often you find children are stuck in this cycle of being punished for being in an environment that is harming them.
Yeah, I recently had a child who came to a legal visit with me who has quite significant ADHD. And the first thing he says, Miss, thanks for having this legal visit so I can get out of my cell. When I first met AB, who was the child whose case we took all the way to the Supreme Court and then the European Court on Human Rights to challenge the use of solitary confinement, the very first time I met him, I have never seen a child so physically affected by ADHD. He was literally sort of bouncing around the room. And that was before he was put in solitary confinement.
And this often impacts on their mental health as well. We've got 440 children in custody, but in 1 year, I think it was 23 to 24, the Ministry of Justice recorded that there was 1,900 incidents of self-harm for 440 children. And I spoke to one young person again who was locked up for 23 hours a day as a punishment for his behaviour. He had ADHD, and he said when he went into custody, his mental health was fine, but he was now having suicidal thoughts and harming himself as a result of being locked up for that length of time.
And the government thinks part of the answer to the problems in child prisons, Anne-Marie, is parva spray, which is a kind of pepper spray. How are they envisaging using it?
I think the Ministry of Justice describe it as a last resort when children are displaying quite violent behaviours towards other children or members of staff. And it's sprayed into the children's eyes, which can then temporarily mean that they can't see. It's very, very painful. And it can cause them to struggle to breathe, to vomit, as they struggle to kind of process physically what's happening to them.
Yeah, so good idea, Laura?
Not a good idea. Think about how anxiously we worry about vaccinations for children, right? And how well tested they are. We have no evidence of the potential short or long-term impacts of using this on children. None. Zero. It's being rolled out, not a pilot, it's literally being rolled out for use on children in all the young offenders institutions without any evidence as to the potential risks. It's supposed to be, as Anne-Marie said, going to be used as a last resort. So is restraint supposed to be used as a last resort? We know it isn't.
Describe what restraint involves.
Restraint involves physically manhandling a child according to approved techniques, but in the heat of the moment, quite often that doesn't happen either. In theory, it's supposed to be used to stop them harming themselves or someone else. But in practice, quite often it is used in a heightened situation to get them to comply with an order. And it's a very frightening experience. And we know that on occasion it has been a precursor to death if children can't breathe properly and it's not done in the correct way. So it's a very scary thing, but it is something that's in the toolkit in prisons. And if we're adding parva in on top, I think we can expect to be very worried indeed about the risk of this going wrong.
They trialled the use of parva against adult males and they found that it didn't reduce violence. So there's actually no evidential base for rolling this out against children at all.
It was also disproportionately used against young black adults
Yes.
in the young adult estate as well. So there's an increased risk of discrimination there too.
You know, if I was a government spokesman, I would say the staff in prisons are at risk because these children are so violent.
The best way to protect staff from risk of violence is to make sure we create environments that are safe for everybody. These are not going to be rolled out in secure children's homes, right?
These are run by local councils, and the kind of leaders in secure children's homes tend to be social workers, and they manage them. Yeah.
They are people who are trained to help and care for children. And we don't have that in the prison service. There are courses that prison officers can do if they're particularly interested in working with children, but it's not an absolute requirement for prison officers. It's a difficult thing, right? If children are traumatised, angry, emotional, let's say hormonal, right? All of these things, any parent knows that's going to be really hard to manage. But that's why you need skill. You need skill at caring, not pepper spray.
Anne-Marie, in addition to the types of custodial establishment we've mentioned already, the government have recently opened this new secure school. How's that different, and what hopes do you have for that?
The secure school was proposed by Charlie Taylor when he reviewed the youth justice system in 2016 as almost an idea of humanising custody in a way. Let's create an education establishment and let's focus on education. Now, this has happened previously with secure training centres and borstals, and we know what happened with those. Essentially, there was accusations of abuse of children. Now, I'm not saying that's happening in the new secure school at all, but it recently opened with good intentions, and it's probably going very well, but it did have a recent Ofsted inspection and requires improvement, and it's still not at full capacity. So there are already challenges and issues which definitely need further investigation, and we need to understand what's going on. Now, if we compare that with secure children's homes, which have been going for a long time, they've all got positive, good Ofsted inspections, and they're dealing with the same group of children. So why are we reinventing the wheel here?
What about you, Laura? Do you think this secure school is worth trying?
As Anne-Marie says, we don't doubt the intentions behind it. But why did Charlie Taylor do that report in 2016 at the time he was appointed by Michael Gove to do it? Because there had been a huge scandal that was captured by Panorama, who went in undercover to the very site that the secure school is now on, which was Medway Secure Training Centre. So this site has history. What Charlie Taylor said in that review was that we should have these secure schools instead of YLYs. So what's really disappointing is that it's been brought online without all the YLYs closing. And I've had a number of occasions where I have asked whether or not a child that I'm representing could possibly go to the secure school, and they've not been allowed to transfer there. It was originally supposed to have a capacity of around 60 children. I think that was reduced then to around 48, and I think it's never had more than about 20 in it so far. So it's certainly not the solution that it was intended to be, and it's not the full answer, no.
Rob, I hate to say this, but you worked in government on the creation of secure training centres. Laura's mentioned a scandal at one, and these were supposed to be the great new form of child custody when they were created. And you can remind me what date that was. What did you learn from being part of setting them up about the difficulties of creating this better alternative?
So this was about 1993. I found myself on a secondment in the Home Office advising ministers on what we then called juvenile justice. And the politicians had this idea of creating a new form of institution specifically for persistent young offenders. And I did, to my shame, help them develop the legislation and the model for doing it. I mean, I think it was essentially misconceived from the word go. It would have been so much better simply to have expanded the secure children's homes we've heard about.
These ones run by social workers.
Yeah, but at the time, Kenneth Clarke, who was the Home Secretary, didn't like local authorities at all, thought these secure children's homes were too soft, so he wanted something entirely different. It was then very odd to give it to security companies to run. Here are some of the most damaged, vulnerable challenging young people in the country, young children. And G4S, the security company, were the organisation that ran it, a company best known for helping transfer money safely from bank to bank. There were 4, briefly, of these institutions. We're now down to 1. I'd be very surprised if that one is still going in 5 years' time. It is really a case study of how not to develop a response to children in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, just constantly reinventing new ways of locking children up is not the answer we need. We have one model that works where it is absolutely necessary. And don't get me wrong, secure children's homes are not perfect. You know, it's still very difficult for a child in that critical period of adolescence, growing up, learning, to go without hugs, right? Let's be clear, you know, that's what being a child in custody means. But they come as close as you can get to good parenting, which is often what's needed for children who have to be detained.
Anne-Marie, the number of children in custody, as we've described, is now small compared to what it used to be. Can we reduce numbers still further?
Easily. I think it's about 40% of the children in custody are currently on remand. So that means that they haven't actually been found guilty as yet of an offence. They're awaiting trial. And of that 40% that are in custody on remand, 63% either went on to be found not guilty or get a community order.
So it's a kind of warehouse to put children while they're waiting for their trial.
Yeah, and with the additional waits as well now for trial, you know, running into several years, you've then got children being held on remand for much longer periods of time, which creates a whole other host of issues where they can potentially then be tried as adults, which I won't get into now, but it is a real issue.
It's not also just children awaiting trial, but you often will have children who are able and ready to plead guilty or waiting sentence but have got nowhere to go. I actually represented a child not so long ago who was in a secure children's home, so he was in a reasonably good environment, but was in detention just because the home local authority hadn't got together a decent package so he could get a community sentence.
So in total limbo.
Yeah, in total limbo. And I had to threaten to take them to court, at which point they then came up with a really good package of support and he was able to get a community sentence and come out. But he waited for 10 months, hugely disruptive to his life, to his progress, can't go to school. And it was only when I said, well, I'll have to take you to court if you don't do this, they came up with a great placement. I went to see him there in the community and he was thriving. But that was about 10 months or more in custody that he spent that he didn't need to.
I mean, Laura, you've worked with the organisation Article 39, I think it's called, to end child imprisonment altogether. But in the last 2 or 3 years, some prison sentences for children have actually increased, I think. I mean, is ending it a kind of pipe dream, or do you think it's a possibility?
So ending imprisonment, this is where we get into the semantics that we talked about earlier, is very much about ending the use of prison-type establishments for children.
Young offender institutions.
Yes.
But is it a pipe dream? Because we have talked about these longer sentences, which is a punitive approach.
So the long sentences are different. So where children are locked up is the focus of what end child imprisonment is on. And they're saying if children do absolutely need to be locked up, if, and that's the big if, then they should be in the secure children's homes. So I do think it is a pipe dream to imagine that we could be in a society where children didn't get sentenced to a custodial sentence at all, but it is absolutely feasible and realistic to make sure that in the small number of cases where that's necessary, we treat them in a way that will make them better and not worse while keeping the public safe, and that is by allowing them to go to secure children's homes rather than prisons.
And this is what they've decided should happen in Scotland, I understand, that under 18-year-olds won't be held in prison-type establishments at all.
Absolutely. So it can't be a pipe dream if it's happening just north of the border.
We're not always very good at learning lessons from north of the border. Perhaps this is one.
Anne-Marie, one thing that we haven't touched on is it is great that the numbers in custody have gone down, but the law has not changed fundamentally for 20 years. Do you ever fear that there could be a terrible case again, like the James Bulger case, and that we haven't got a legal framework which actually prevents the numbers shooting back up again?
I mean, this is why the government won't increase the age of criminal responsibility. They're fearful, I think, of a response from the public. We've got a right-wing media that kind of very much seems to dictate policy. And if there was a high-profile case, I think there is a real fear that, again, there would be a very harsh shift towards locking lots of children up again. This idea that we should understand a little less and punish a little more, or something. Was it John Major said after James Bulger?
Condemn, I think.
Condemn a little more. It would be that kind of rhetoric which would then potentially be used to justify, well, if they're adult enough to commit the crime, then they should be able to go into an adult prison. And it is a fear because we are making some progress. Numbers have reduced. The secure school has been built. We're hoping that we can keep putting pressure on government to replicate what's gone on in Scotland. But at the end of the day, we are almost one serious incident away from everything falling apart, and there isn't any protection in legislation. We do have the UNCRC. It would be nice to see that written into legislation.
That's the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Yeah.
What do you think, Laura? Do you think there is a risk of things going backwards, as it were?
There's always a risk unless you do anything to actively stop it. As a matter of law, in English law, custody should be a last resort for a child. You know, the whole system is supposed to be grounded on welfare and preventing offending. And actually, if government is serious about public concern, then what we want to do is to prevent offending in the first place. We know that deterrence doesn't work for children. We know it doesn't really work very well for anyone, but particularly for children whose brains are still developing and who aren't able to sort of step back and say, ooh, if I do this, I may be facing a mandatory life sentence or something. It just doesn't work like that. So really, the big thing is to try and see what we can do to better prevent harm in the first place.
Well, perhaps that's a good place to draw things to a close. We end these episodes by asking each of our guests, if they were Lord Chancellor, what one thing would you do, in this case, to improve the treatment of children in custody? Anne-Marie, what would you do?
I would make a commitment to close all young offenders institutions within the next 3 years, and also at the same time roll out a plan of transferring children to secure children's homes within that time as well, and releasing those that don't necessarily need to be imprisoned.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
Well, Anne-Marie's taken my wish. I would close the YOIs immediately.
That's fine.
Right, well, no, she said 3 years. You said immediately.
I would announce the closure immediately. The government has already committed to closing the YOIs some time ago, but not really done anything about it. And so I would make that commitment now to actually start the programme of closing the YOIs.
Mm-hmm. Penelope, what about you?
I would reduce the numbers because I do think we could reduce the numbers vastly even now. And I think if we got the numbers down, we would have the resources and capacity and kind of headspace to treat children better. What about you, Rob?
Well, I agree with all of what's been suggested. I think one bit of work that definitely needs doing is to look a bit more closely at these secure children's homes. So at the moment, as I understand it, they don't have to accept particular children. They can't be required by...
They can't be forced to take a child.
No, nor can the secure school. I can understand why that is the case, but I think if we're going to move towards what Anne-Marie, Laura and yourself have suggested, we need that alternative estate to be capable of taking some, at least, of the young people that go into young offender institutions.
Great. Thanks, Rob, Anne-Marie and Laura. And for more information about the work of these two brilliant women, please refer to our programme notes. Thanks and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.